And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Mekong River Basin today. But really what I would like to do is be a little bit provocative, kind of in the spirit of Filippo, and ask some big questions about dams. I think that's kind of the point of the Water Hubs series, and asking these big questions. And in doing that, I'd like to sort of give you a quick overview of what I would like to do. So people have used, sometimes we overuse the phrase crisis, but a lot of commentators have characterized the current state of the Mekong River Basin in Southeast Asia, and I'll show you a map, don't worry, I'm a geographer, in a moment, as a point of crisis. And there are good reasons for that. I don't want to overemphasize it, but I think it's a fair assessment, and talk a little bit about how that has come to be. I also want to emphasize when we think about dams and politics and rivalries, remember the root, rival, river. I'm not an etymologist, but I think they do have similar roots. So it's impossible for me to separate out river basins from dam politics. I also want to briefly mention something that Filippo also alluded to, the importance of taking a historical perspective. And I've done that through using an amalgamated word. I apologize, this is one of my few jargony things. The idea of technopolitics, which is, as you can sort of see, is in emphasizing that technical expertise is always political in all sorts of ways. So I hope I can convey that. And then I would just like to close with some thoughts about how to understand the multiple forces that are driving hydropower development in the world today and have done so in the past, but also maybe talk about the overarching theme of our presentations, that is these rivalries, power, and hope. Because sometimes it's hard to find. Coming from the United States, it can be extremely hard to find right now, but there is room for hope, and there are spaces for hope. That's all I will say in terms of editorializing. So the current moment, this is the Mekong River Basin. It's one of the world's largest by flow, by area. It's shared by 6 riparian countries or riparian states. It starts in the Tibetan Plateau and flows primarily through the Yunnan province in China. Really briefly, a very small chunk of the basin belongs to Myanmar. And then what's called the lower Mekong Basin, which is mainly what I will talk about today, includes Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia. And this is a map you see of the series of presently constructed and future proposed dams, not just on the mainstream of the river, and this is important, but also in the tributaries throughout the basin. Many of the most economically feasible dam projects in the Mekong on the tributaries have been built. And in the upper basin in Yunnan province, there's 7, I think, nearly 8 completed almost entirely hydroelectric projects in the Chinese portion of the basin. But the reason there has been such a rivalry, and it's been in the news a lot recently, is that the Lao government has decided, in a way that sort of challenges the traditional institutional arrangements that have been in place in the Mekong since the late 1950s, that challenges sort of the upstream-downstream relationships between the nation states, and has caused a lot of controversy, as you might imagine. But there's also this vision that's been emerging from civil society throughout the Mekong region, maybe starting initially in Thailand in the 1980s, but also becoming more prominent in places like Cambodia, Mekong Delta in Vietnam, and also Laos. That see the river in a different way, and that's one of the points that I want to drive home today. So when we think about dams as one aspect of how human beings might relate with rivers, is it the best way to think about? Best is a very loaded term, I apologize. But is the only way, or is it the preferred way that we want to think about those river-society relations? Because there are alternatives, as several of the questions today have pointed out. So here you see some protesters. These are folks in Thailand protesting against one of the Lao dams that the Lao government is building upstream. And I made this claim that there are many Mekongs. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, in a sense, that the Mekong River Basin as a region, as a geographical entity, certainly has a biophysical reality in terms of water flows, floodplain relations, and all those kinds of things. But it also has other kinds of constructed identities. One is geopolitical. I just mentioned these rivalries between the countries in the basin and concerns over dams being built upstream and what that might do to, say, the Mekong Delta, most of which sits about 1 meter above sea level. It's an incredibly important rice-growing region. It is seeing sea level inundation and has the added problem of climate change and rising seas. It's also a geoeconomic entity. So for around 20 years, the Asian Development Bank has promoted this idea of the Greater Mekong sub-region, which sees sort of consolidation of the economies, including that of southern China and the lower Mekong Basin countries, in a way that would include a vast electricity transmission grid, tourism, you name it, every aspect of economic development you could possibly imagine. And certainly last but not least, there is the biophysical Mekong, which I mentioned, but also, I don't have time to give you all the amazing statistics. This one, and I apologize, this is a very small map. Of all of the world's inland wild capture fisheries, freshwater, the Mekong estimate produces 20% of that fishery. So for the 80 million people who live in the basin, not all, I'm not saying all are dependent on fisheries, but many of them have fisheries as an important part of their livelihood patterns. The potential for dams to damage those fisheries and fisheries-based livelihoods is of course immense and of great concern, and again sets the stage for certainly politics. So, as where he went, as Julian predicted, that we are seeing this map again because there has been what's called a global boom. If the 20th century is what I call the concrete revolution occurred, sort of akin to the Green Revolution, but in terms of dams and concrete. Are we looking at another one? And the only thing I would add to what Julian was saying is that there is a geography to this global boom. If you notice where most of the dams predicted to be built over the next century, I would say, are in what I call the tricontinental world, so Asia, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. And there's also a geopolitics to this, which I will hopefully get into. So it's sort of theoretical inspiration for my work that I've done over the last few years. I'm looking at the history of large dams and the connection to geopolitics. I've borrowed from somebody who I think is one of our really great thinkers in the social sciences. This is Timothy Mitchell, who wrote a book several years ago called Rule of Experts. And without belaboring the point, he sees technopolitics as a particularly potent way that technical expertise and geopolitical power came together in the 20th century, particularly under the auspices of the Cold War, to promote economic development quite rapidly and in ways that perhaps were not as thought through as they might have been had that geopolitical context not been as powerful as it was. He also sees the technopolitics as a way of organizing the amalgam of the human and non-human. So dams are a perfect example of the ways that human technical expertise, financial resources, capital, labor come together with flowing water, fish, floodplain dynamics, ecologies in all kinds of ways. And lastly, and this was a very important point that Mitchell made, and I think one that, again, is typical of dams, is that the intentions of these technopolitical objects, in terms of hydroelectricity production, irrigation water, drinking water, et cetera, they're constantly overrun by unintended consequences. Things, I would say something else, but I'm in polite company, stuff happens. And just as an example, and I'll just talk about this case in a moment, I've studied the US Bureau of Reclamation, which is the United States' premier dam building agency, built a lot of the big famous like Hoover Dam projects in the western United States. They also traveled the world throughout roughly period late 1930s, throughout 1970s, and during the peak of Cold War geopolitics, to transmit the lessons, presumably all good ones, of dam building and river basin development throughout the world. So they were actually in Lebanon doing work on the Litani Basin in the 1950s. This is an older article talking about the desire to turn the Litani into the Arab world's Tennessee Valley Authority, which is another project in the United States that became a global model. At some point when they were actually building the dam, the tunnel that they were using to excavate simply collapsed and was buried under thousands of metric tons of sand. And it ended up delaying the project on the score of 2 years. So something always in Mitchell's model always seems to happen. So as I mentioned, I became curious about 10 years ago, maybe long before that. I'm curious enough where I wanted to do research on this question, is I was wondering, why do we live on a damned planet? Maybe pun is slightly intended, or the double entendre. That's the extent of my French, I apologize. And the US Bureau of Reclamation was based in Denver, Colorado. Like I said, it built all of these large dams in the western United States. It became renowned as the mecca of technical expertise for dam building and river basin development throughout the world. And to make a long story short, engineers from the Bureau traveled to over 108 different countries throughout the world. And again, there's a prominent geography that this pretty terrible map can't quite show, but it's taken directly from one of the documents of the Bureau. Most of the places they went were proxy regions where the Cold War was actually a hot war. or also known as shatter belts, so Southeast Asia, certainly parts of East Africa, other places where they were also sometimes considered conflict zones. And of course, the lower Mekong, Southeast Asia being perhaps the paramount example, excuse me, along with the Vietnam/American War, starting in the late 1950s and going on through the 1970s. So the Bureau was in the Mekong early, actually designed a whole scheme of several large projects, but there was a very obvious geopolitical or foreign policy aimed at this. So the Bureau worked quite closely with the United States State Department. And again, if you want to read the book, that would be great. It was intimately tied to the foreign policy objectives of the US government vis-a-vis containment of the Soviet Union and spread of communism. And so there's countless quotes coming from engineers knowing exactly what it was. They still believe very fervently in the power of dams to promote economic benefits, hydroelectricity and so on, but they also recognized what the geopolitical stakes were. I'm almost ready to conclude. I would just say, historicizing is important to looking at projects and how they develop and why they've occurred and what sometimes are the unexpected, say, geopolitical rationales of developing large dams. But dams themselves have a temporality. Maybe contrary, maybe some dams will keep coming, as Filippo was saying, and dams will still be here, but all dams do have a lifetime. They are not on the planet or in those rivers forever. And what are we going to do, we collectively, as a global society, if I can use that term, going to do when those dams start to fall apart and fail. This is a diagram that I love, but it was so horrendously complicated that my book editors told me I could absolutely refuse to put it in the book. So I'm bringing it to you as a special feature. And it's simply to underscore a lot of what has already been said today. Large dams are incredibly complicated entities, but they consolidate all of these networks of processes that might be symbolic, related to modernization and nationalization, political, economic, financial, social, ecological, eco-hydrologic, techno-scientific, engineering, historical, and probably some networks and processes that we haven't even identified at this point. That's the question mark. So in conclusion, and I think this has already been pointed out, conflicts over dams are never only about dams. They're really about the social, political, economic, ideological conditions that create dams in the first instance. And also knowledge counts incredibly. I won't have time to go into this in detail. One of my future projects is actually looking at the politics of knowledge circulation in the Mekong, how data is transferred, especially really important data about flows, sediment, and fisheries, and how countries at the government scale share that, but also how is that disseminated to, say, local communities who are probably bearing the brunt of a lot of some of the impacts of large dams. I'm going to skip over the third one. I always like that there is a logical sort of distinction between necessary versus sufficient conditions for sustainability. We can come back to that if you have questions. And ways forward, I just wanted to mention one of my other projects is I can't get away from dams completely. I've recently been in New England in the United States and looking at dam removal conflicts. So these are proposed usually by state governments like Vermont, where I'm from, and Hampshire, Maine, other places that are actually taking dams out. Most of them are old industrial, dams from the industrial era that have been simply, they have no useful function at this point in terms of electricity or being water power for old mills or things like that. But a couple of large hydroelectric projects have indeed been removed in the United States. And I know also in France, in Sweden, I think in Japan, in Australia. So it's very interesting to me, dam removal to me represents river restoration, does represent a different way of looking at how humans relate and interact with rivers in a very interesting way. And so are we going to be talking more about dam removal in the future as opposed to only the politics of dam construction? Thank you very much.